Laos was never supposed to matter like this. Yet today it sits at the center of a regional rail system that quietly reshaped its future. For decades, it was described the same way in policy briefings and trade reports. Landlocked, mountainous, difficult to access, a country surrounded by growth, but never part of it. Geography, not politics, was treated as the explanation. Then something quietly changed. In December 2021, a passenger train crossed the Chinese border and reached Vientiane in just 4 hours. A journey that once took nearly an entire day collapsed into a single morning. Distance, which had defined Laos for generations, suddenly stopped behaving the way everyone expected it to. At first glance, this looked like a familiar story. Another high-speed rail project. Another headline about connectivity and modern infrastructure. But what caught the attention of regional planners and logistics firms was not the speed. It was the consistency. The train ran on time, every day, through terrain that had defeated roads, rivers, and decades of development plans. This was not a cosmetic upgrade. It was a structural shift. Laos had spent most of its modern history weakly connected, not because it lacked neighbors, but because its geography worked against internal and external movement at the same time. Goods were easier to move across borders than across the country itself. Provinces functioned like islands separated by mountains, flooding, and unreliable roads. Being landlocked was only part of the problem. Being fragmented was the real constraint. The railway changed that constraint overnight. Suddenly, cities that once felt remote were predictable distances apart. Labor could move without planning around weather. Tourism no longer depended on endurance. And for the first time, Laos sat directly on a continuous north-to-south artery linking southern China to Southeast Asia. That sounds like development. But here's a question almost no one asked at the start. When a country stops being a destination and becomes a corridor, who actually benefits? Because moving faster is one thing. Letting other people's trade flow through your territory is something very different. And once that flow starts, it is extremely hard to turn it off. To understand why that matters, you have to look past the headlines and speed figures and examine the one constraint Laos could never escape, until now. Each section reveals a constraint, dependency, or consequence that was not visible at the start, moving from geography to infrastructure limits, to trade flow, and finally to control. Nothing escalates suddenly. What changes is what the viewer is allowed to see. Calling Laos landlocked was always an oversimplification. Plenty of landlocked countries function just fine. Switzerland exports high-value manufacturing. Austria anchors Central European logistics. Even Mongolia, remote and sparsely populated, is connected to major rail corridors. Being landlocked is a challenge, not a dead end. What made Laos different was how it was landlocked. Roughly 70% of the country is mountainous terrain. Hills, plateaus, and steep valleys dominate the map. Rivers run north to south. But Laos's most important trade partners sit east and west. The Mekong, often described as a lifeline, mostly connects Laos to other landlocked regions or flows toward borders it does not control. This created a structural problem that policy alone could not fix. Moving goods inside the country was often harder than moving them out of it. A truck traveling from northern Laos to the south could take days on winding mountain roads. Seasonal flooding regularly cut off entire provinces. Even major cities felt disconnected from one another. Infrastructure existed, but it did not scale. Roads wore out quickly. River transport was shallow and seasonal. Air freight was far too expensive for bulk trade. Laos sat between Thailand, Vietnam, China, Cambodia, and Myanmar, yet remained economically bypassed by all of them. It was close to everything, but connected to nothing. This was not just inconvenient geography. It was economic fragmentation. A country broken into functional islands, where distance inside the borders mattered more than distance to the outside world. And as long as that fragmentation existed, no amount of trade agreements or investment incentives could turn Laos into a serious participant in regional commerce. That is the constraint the railway was designed to remove. Once it became clear that geography was the real constraint, the solutions seemed obvious. Build more roads. Laos did exactly that. With support from international donors and development banks, road networks expanded across the country. Travel improved. Villages became reachable. On paper, the problem appeared manageable. In practice, the limits were structural. Laos's terrain works against scale. Mountain roads add distance instead of removing it. Heavy rainfall accelerates wear. Landslides disrupt routes without warning. Every additional kilometer increases fuel use, maintenance costs, and transit time. For freight, these constraints compound quickly. Trucks move limited volume. Delays multiply. Reliability collapses under scale. Rivers were no solution either. The Mekong is seasonal, shallow in places, and poorly aligned with Laos's main trade directions. Freight was never viable for bulk goods. Laos was not lacking infrastructure. It was lacking a system that could move large volumes predictably, year after year, regardless of terrain or weather. That is the difference rail introduced. The question was whether the country could ever afford to build it. When the railway opened, most of the attention went to speed. 4 hours instead of a full day. 2 hours between cities that once felt distant. Headlines framed it as Laos entering the high-speed era. That framing missed the point. Speed is impressive. Reliability is transformative. Before the railway, traveling a few hundred kilometers by bus could take 6 hours on a good day or 10 hours on a bad one. Weather, traffic, road damage, and breakdowns made every trip unpredictable. You did not schedule travel with confidence. You built buffer time and hoped for the best. The train removed that uncertainty. It arrived on time, every day, regardless of rain, traffic, or season. Distance stopped being something you planned your life around and started being something you could ignore. That change altered behavior immediately. Students could attend universities in the capital and return home on weekends. Business owners could schedule meetings across cities in a single day. Families could reach hospitals and services without relocating permanently. Tourism stopped being an endurance test and became a routine decision. Economists call this labor mobility. But for people living inside the system, it felt like something more basic. For the first time, distance stopped deciding what was possible. Cities that once planned around isolation began behaving as if connection was permanent, not conditional. That internal shift mattered before a single container ever crossed a border. At this stage, the railway looked like a clear success. But passenger rail is the visible part of the system. The real leverage of any railway shows up somewhere else entirely. And that is where the story starts to change direction. Passenger trains draw attention. Freight determines leverage. In its first full year of operation, the railway moved more than 11 million tons of cargo. The year after that, nearly 18 million. By the third year, close to 20 million tons were moving annually. This growth came from trade, not tourism. Before the railway, moving goods between southern China and Laos meant trucks, border delays, and unpredictable timelines. Journeys stretched across days with no reliability. Rail collapsed that uncertainty. What once took days by road could now be done in just over a day, consistently. For time-sensitive goods, that difference determines pricing and competitiveness. This is where Laos's role began to change. The railway did not just help Laos export north. It made the country useful as a transit route between much larger economies. Goods moving from China toward Thailand and wider Southeast Asia now had a predictable overland option that was faster than sea routes and more stable than trucking. At that point, the railway stopped behaving like domestic infrastructure and started functioning as part of a larger system. The question becomes who controls the system that makes it work. Becoming a corridor sounds like an upgrade. Goods move through your territory. Fees are collected. Trade volumes rise. On paper, everyone wins. But corridors follow a different economic logic than producing economies. For Laos, the railway positioned the country between two vastly larger economies. China to the north, Thailand and the wider ASEAN market to the south. For the first time, Laos was not just adjacent to regional trade. It sat inside it. This is why the railway matters strategically. Overland corridors provide redundancy. When sea routes are disrupted by pandemics, port congestion, or geopolitical tension, alternatives suddenly become critical. An inland rail route running reliably every day is not just efficient. It is insurance. From China's perspective, the value is obvious. A southern outlet into Southeast Asia that reduces dependence on maritime choke points. From Laos's perspective, the value is access. Integration into regional supply chains it could never reach on its own. But corridor status comes with a trade-off. When goods move through your country instead of being produced in it, leverage shifts toward whoever controls the system enabling that movement. Fees matter, volume matters, but control matters more than both. This is the moment the story stops being about geography and starts being about power. Because infrastructure does not just connect places. It locks relationships in place. And the terms of that relationship were set long before the first train ever ran. Up to this point, the railway looks like leverage. But this is where the story turns. Because the real question is no longer whether trade moves through Laos. It is what Laos had to give up to make that flow possible, and whether that cost was visible at the moment the deal was signed. This is where the story changes. The shift became visible not in a speech or ribbon cutting, but in the structure of the project itself. Public joint venture arrangements and financing structures showed something easy to miss at first glance. The same system providing the capital was also positioned to operate, maintain, and technically govern the railway once it opened. Equity, debt, and operations were not separate layers. They reinforced each other, because the railway was not just an engineering project. It was a financial and operational arrangement that defined who would ultimately control the corridor. The total cost came in at roughly $6 billion. Laos did not have that kind of capital, so the project was structured as a joint venture, with financing, equity, and control split between Lao and Chinese entities. On paper, it looked balanced. In reality, it wasn't. China holds a majority equity stake. Laos holds a minority share. To fund even that minority position, Laos had to borrow heavily from Chinese lenders. Part of the country's contribution to the railway was financed by debt owed to the same system that would later operate it. That matters, because ownership is only one layer of control. The deeper layer is operations. The trains are Chinese. The signaling systems are Chinese. The maintenance protocols are Chinese. The technical expertise required to keep the system running comes from China. Laos does not manufacture high-speed rolling stock. It does not produce advanced rail signaling equipment. It does not have a deep domestic pool of engineers trained to operate and maintain this kind of system independently. So while the railway runs through Laos, the knowledge that keeps it running does not. This is the documentary wow moment. The railway did not make Laos powerful by increasing what it produces. It made Laos relevant by allowing other countries' trade to pass through it. And relevance without control creates asymmetry. If disputes arise over pricing, access, or operations, one side can negotiate from technical authority while the other cannot. That is not coercion. It is dependency built into infrastructure. None of this means the railway was a mistake. It means the cost of becoming a corridor is not just financial. It is structural. Once a country's economy is physically integrated into a larger neighbor's logistics system, independence does not disappear, but it does narrow. At this point in the story, the railway looks very different than it did at the start. It is no longer just about connectivity. It is about alignment. By the time the railway was fully operational, the consequences were no longer theoretical. Passenger numbers surged. Freight volumes climbed year after year. Laos was no longer isolated. It was moving. Goods were flowing north and south with a consistency the country had never experienced before. But this is where the central tension reaches its peak. Because the more successful the corridor becomes, the more dependent Laos becomes on the system that sustains it. The railway ties Laos's economic relevance to uninterrupted flow. Flow of Chinese exports. Flow of regional freight. Flow of tourists and transit traffic. If that flow slows, Laos feels it immediately. If it accelerates, Laos benefits, but largely on terms it does not fully control. This is the paradox of corridor economics. The country hosting the corridor becomes essential to trade, yet remains structurally weaker than the actors using it. Revenue comes from transit fees and services, not from owning supply chains or setting prices. Value passes through faster than it can be captured locally. And once a country reorganizes its economy around that role, walking away is no longer an option. Infrastructure is not something you can renegotiate easily. Tracks do not move. Tunnels do not vote. Debt schedules do not care about political cycles. At this point, the railway has already done its irreversible work. It has rewritten geography. The China-Laos Railway did not turn Laos into an industrial powerhouse. It did not suddenly create factories, technology clusters, or export dominance. What it gave Laos was positioning. For the first time in its modern history, the country moved from the edge of regional planning into its center, not as a producer or decision-maker, but as an indispensable passage inside other people's systems. But positioning is only leverage if it is used. If Laos builds logistics services, industrial zones, and domestic capacity along the corridor, the railway can become a platform for development rather than just a passageway. If it does not, Laos risks becoming a permanent transit space, useful, busy, and economically thin. This is not a unique dilemma. Every corridor country faces it. But the stakes are higher when the partner on the other end is vastly larger, wealthier, and more technologically advanced. The railway removed distance. Asymmetry remained. And that distinction will define whether this project is remembered as a foundation for long-term growth or as a beautifully engineered system that mainly served others. Laos spent centuries boxed in by mountains. Now it has options. What matters next is not the railway itself, but what Laos builds around it. And this raises a question worth debating. Is becoming a corridor a stepping stone toward real leverage, or a permanent role that quietly limits how much control a country can ever reclaim?